What's up, everyone, and welcome back to The Lawyer You Know. Today we are reacting and responding to Thomas Binger's interview on a podcast called Miranda Warnings, where he went into shocking detail about what he thought, what he tried to do, and how he still feels about that Kyle Rittenhouse case and Kyle Rittenhouse trial. And I am not just putting clickbait out there right now, where I was shocked at how spicy this interview was. We're gonna link that podcast in the description if you wanna hear the whole thing. It was about an hour. I'm gonna try to make this much shorter than that and pick out some quotes that I found so interesting. As someone who has been a prosecutor before and prosecuted these cases, been a criminal defense lawyer and defended cases like this and tried cases and reflected on trials and how we thought it went and what went well, what didn't go well, what our strategy was, what our plan was, and how it actually worked out. Wow, did he give us a lot of detail. And this is one of the interesting things about being a prosecutor. He doesn't necessarily have client confidentiality that he has to keep, so he can go talk about it if his office will allow him to, and we'll hear about the position and power he has at his office that we made some guesses and inferences to in other videos. Well, now he's answered that question and many other questions we may have had throughout this process that we've asked on this channel personally, and you guys have asked in the comments. We're also going to talk about somebody else he has charged and is prosecuting and would have charged and potentially thrown in jail if he would have gotten the opportunity to charge and prosecute him. There's a ton in this video, so I'm going to pull out some quotes and we're going to talk through it together. As always, thanks for joining us, and subscribe to our page if you haven't already. A huge percentage of you do not subscribe to our page that watch these videos and interact in the comments, so I'd love if you did subscribe to the videos. And just not enough likes on these videos, guys. If you like it when you watch it, please hit the like button so that we know it, and we'll continue to put out content that hopefully you guys find is interesting. So, just to give a little background about this podcast. Lawyers do podcasts with each other and post them to bar websites. Sometimes we can get CLE credits, continuing legal education credits, and it seems like that's what this podcast was for. And the main audience for this podcast was very clearly to lawyers listening in to this podcast. So it wasn't necessarily made for the general public or even for most of you watching this YouTube video now. And they started out, it seemed like the opening of the trial. Kenosha's a small town.
Kenosha is a community that is a small community, and we don't have these sorts of events happen. Most communities don't.
And the white police officer shooting and killing the black man is why we had these protests, and the riots severely affected our small community, right? So they kind of opened the podcast like Binger opened and talked a lot through the trial.
But it's one in which we had a lot of personal experience. It started with the shooting of a black man by a white police officer, which led to a lot of protests, which then turned into riots and arson and looting.
It was very interesting from the jump to start to hear what some of the concerns Binger had about taking this case to trial and charging this case. And by the end of the podcast, we hear whether or not he regrets it, and if he would have changed the charges or if he was even able to affect the charges in this case. And we'll get to that because that's kind of at the end of the interview. He said he was concerned that a lot of people thought I would have done what Kyle Rittenhouse did if I had the wherewithal or the gumption or the cojones to go out and protect property and stop these riots because it was killing our small community.
The biggest concern I had about this trial was that there were a lot of people out there that felt that they would have done the same thing, that this is a hero, that this is someone who did what a lot of people didn't have the wherewithal to do on their own, which is to go out there and arm themselves and protect our community.
And the interviewer shows his hand right away. I don't know this guy, Miranda, at all. Seems like a nice enough guy, but I don't think he watched this trial, if you want my honest opinion, because he shows his hand multiple times throughout the interview that he's just misstating facts when he said,
this is someone that drove across state lines with an automatic weapon.
And Binger, give him credit for this, actually corrected him. He's like, no, actually it was purchased here.
I do want to clear up one little misconception out there, Dave, that you just mentioned, and I hear this from a lot of people. There's a belief out there that he crossed state lines with the gun, and that actually is not true.
Oh,
This is a weapon that never left the state of Wisconsin. It was bought in a small town in Wisconsin. It was kept at his friend's residence in Kenosha, and when he came up that day, he did get it from his friend's residence.
It's like, oh, well, that was a big deal that the media was telling us and turned out not to be true. Binger even knew it wasn't true and corrected him. But that was a bad question by the interviewer, and he has a couple other missteps throughout the process. But Binger basically said he was concerned that a lot of people look at Kyle Rittenhouse and said, I would have done what he did. These people were being crazy, rioting, looting, burning. He went out there and protected the community and protected himself. At one point in the interview, he said, well, why didn't he go protect a church or a school? As if that would have made it better than a used car lot. Not sure what the distinction there was to Binger, but he was worried that people would relate to Kyle's decisions and do what Rittenhouse did in this situation, at least as far as go out there with a gun. A lot of people on our comments and in some of our lives said, should have never gone out there. I agreed, it's an unwise decision, but not illegal. Well, Binger was worried that people wouldn't see it that way. And they would have just thought it's perfectly fine for him to go out there and defend these properties. So he said from the very beginning, basically, his strategy, and we get a look into Binger's mind. Why did he push so hard? Why did he charge Kyle Rittenhouse with this level of criminal behavior? Why did he push so hard for the maxes as opposed to just try to get him on a gun charge or a curfew charge or something like that, or an involuntary manslaughter or something? Why did he push the way that he did? Why did he take it all the way to trial? Why did he do this? Well, he lets us know. He said that he, in his pretrial motions and arguments that we saw a lot of, thought the jury deserved to know that Kyle Rittenhouse was a member or associated with the Proud Boys and basically a white supremacist, and that he wanted to use his gun in an unjustified manner, and they should have known that he said he wishes he had his AR to shoot shoplifters just 15 days before these shootings occurred. So keeping those two things out, which we knew was a big deal at the time, and we broke those down in a prior video, but Binger is letting us into his mind saying he felt so strongly about this because basically his connection to the Proud Boys and his connection to a certain political party, and he was there to prove a point, which we'll get to some of those quotes later. That's why Binger was pushing so hard for this case, and he wanted the jury to be able to know what Kyle Rittenhouse's political beliefs were, what he thought, what he did, and why he did this. And he thought that connection to the Proud Boys and his flippant use of wanting to shoot people with his AR-15 before would have convicted Kyle Rittenhouse. There's a reason those types of things are not led into trial, because posting something on the Proud Boys page or having some link to the Proud Boys page does not make you a part of the Proud Boys. It does not make you a white supremacist. It does not make you a murderer. But Binger admits he was going to try to use that evidence that does not prove that to infer something to try to convict somebody that's not guilty of murder. That should be very concerning to everyone out there, of how prosecutors literally use these things. It's not racism, right? I'm not going to say it's racism, but prosecutors have used this same logic for minority defendants to try to infer their race. So I'm not going to say anything about their race, but infer that their race makes them a murderer or makes them more likely to do something, whatever their race may be. This is the same kind of logic that's problematic. Not calling him a racist or anything like that, but understand that this line of logic saying, oh, because he has this link, or because he looks like this, or because he has said this before, it means he's going to commit this crime. That's problematic to me. It's a problematic line of thinking. The jury didn't get to hear who he really was. That was one of the quotes. Then, also candid from Binger, and I was kind of shocked that he said this, but we had less than sympathetic victims. He said that multiple times. And we'll get into what he thought of Gage Grosskreuz's testimony a little bit later. He talked a little bit about some of the legal arguments, the distinction between deadly force and self-defense, and the difference of the fact that Kyle Rittenhouse, he believed, instigated it by bringing his gun and pointing his gun at people, that he instigated all this. So he gave us a little bit of his legal angles of why he was doing it. Not as spicy, not as important. We knew that just by listening to him. Another thing that came out in the pretrial motions, and they talked about this like, we're lawyers. Let's talk about some of these distinctions. Isn't it so unfair how Schroeder acted throughout the case? Didn't let you call them victims, but they were allowed to call them rioters or arsonists or whatever. And Binger said, yeah, it was unfair, but that's how Schroeder acts in every case. A little bit more on that later, but also very important. He said, didn't it feel like it put the victims on trial? And they said, yes, it was so unfair how they put the victims on trial. Well, really, a lot of the background of the victims was not put before the jury. The former criminal behavior, the rap sheets of some of these victims, where they were just hours before the shootings happened. There were some references to I don't want to go back to jail or whatever that was on video, but they didn't get into, they just scratched the surface on the backgrounds of these victims. As far as putting these victims on trial, it could have been a lot worse, in my opinion. Now, Binger felt the victims were too much put on trial. Let me know what you think in the comments if you think the victims were put too much on trial. Because I saw the judge limiting what the defense was allowed to use over and over again in pretrial motions and in the trial. He doubled down on the fact that too many people in their community were going to think it was okay to go out and shoot arsonists and looters because they saw how devastating it was to their community. Think about that as we continue to hear why he made these charging decisions and if he would change his mind. He said people reasonably feel that way, and obviously the jury came down with that verdict, so people in the community, including the jurors, do not agree with Binger, who thinks that that's just a route to chaos, and they should have let law enforcement arrest these looters and rioters, and he would have prosecuted them. But if you remember back, that was not happening. All of these arsonists and looters and rioters at the time were not getting arrested. Now he's prosecuting some, which we'll talk about. Now they're using these videos to prosecute some. I'm sure it has nothing to do with the how big in the media and how much attention was put on the Kyle Rittenhouse case. But now they're prosecuting some of them using the videos. But at the time, can we really believe that they were going to prosecute all these rioters and looters? I don't know. The jury represents our community, and they have spoken, and they are okay with this behavior. Binger said he stands against it, but he respects that decision. That's good. All of us should feel that way in a trial. What the jury decides, we should respect their decision, even if we disagree with it. And he made this quote, and I actually agree with this. My sincere hope is this doesn't lead to copycats. I agree. My sincere hope is this does not lead to copycats, that people go do stuff like this in hopes to say it was like Kyle Rittenhouse in self-defense. But I will say, anyone who does do that is foolish. If they think Kyle Rittenhouse had an easy ride and wasn't scared of going to prison for the rest of his life and stressed out of his mind throughout this trial and throughout this entire process and have threats against his life, yeah, he's probably going to write a book or do a documentary or something at this point, but nobody should want to do this because I think it was closer than you think. I think if he made one wrong move on video and he didn't take the evasive action and he didn't wait till Gage pulled the gun, because I do think Kyle had some kind of training to be able to do this, because I don't think I would have done it as well as he did. But you make one wrong move and it's murder and you're going to prison for the rest of your life. So this should not at all encourage copycats. And Binger is right about that. All of our sincere hope is this does not encourage copycats. So here's where Binger gets a little bit more into how he really feels about Kyle's character and person. And we'll talk at the end if this can be used as defamation or some kind of lawsuit against Binger by Kyle Rittenhouse.
That this is a kid who had his own agenda. And this is the point of the trial that we couldn't get to because the judge wouldn't allow us to. But this is a kid who had his own beliefs, who had his own agenda, who wanted to make a point. And he was clearly on, to simplify things, on one side of the public debate here. And I'm not trying to criticize or defend or whatever either side. Everybody's entitled to their opinions. But let's not hide the fact that he was there because of those beliefs, and he was there to strike a blow for those beliefs.
And again, the connection to the Proud Boys. He said Proud Boys multiple times throughout this interview. So is this defamation? Did this trial prove that that is false? Because in defamation, you have to prove that what these people are saying is actually false, and then that it affects you, and there are other elements. But did we come with a not guilty verdict on these murder charges that prove what Binger's saying here is false? And the answer is no. They did not prove that he was not a racist or a white supremacist or part of Proud Boys or a horrible guy with a political agenda. They did not prove that. All that was proved with this not guilty verdict is he was not guilty of murder. And it was a justified shooting. That's what was proven with this case. So for Binger to come out and talk about this stuff, especially when he says, I wasn't allowed to get into it, so legally there hasn't been an answer on a lot of these questions. So I don't think it's really going to fit into that defamation box. Let me know if you disagree with me. And he said we should have been able to give that side of the story, not just give one side of the story, which is a joke that he thinks only one side of the story was given in this case. He's the prosecutor. He was allowed to bring it. He knew pre-trial he wasn't going to be allowed to get into the Proud Boys stuff. He knew pre-trial he wasn't going to be allowed to get into the comments about shooting before, and he still decided to continue to prosecute this case. He has the leverage. He has the decision-making power, not the defense. Don't forget that. He's seeming like he was the defense almost in this case, like he didn't have a choice in prosecuting it. All right, a big portion of their discussion was centered around Judge Schroeder, and the interviewer clearly wanted to get into the fact that he felt like Judge Schroeder was biased and unfair, and he couldn't believe the way that he talked to Binger. What did Binger think? Binger, again, so candid, way more candid than I would probably be about any judge while I was still a practicing attorney potentially in front of them. But he said,
Judge Schroeder is a man, a judge who barks, and we've all dealt with judges like that. Been shocked at some of his behavior, but honestly, it's par for the course with him. Off the bench, he is one of the nicest human beings you could ever meet. But when he puts the robe on, like some judges, he changes.
But he said this is exactly how he always acts. He's a little bit, I don't remember what he said, he's got his little, kooks with him, and he does some weird things like Jeopardy and his phone ringing, but he has these little weird things that he does, but that's how he is in every case, which, boom, that's proof right there from the prosecutor who lost, who was at trial with him, who has tried multiple cases over the years at Judge Schroeder, that he was not biased for Kyle Rittenhouse. A lot of us, me included, seemed like he had a little slant toward the defense. Binger basically put that to sleep in this interview. He said, no, this is how he is in every case. The whole victims thing, how he acts, how he barks at me during trial. He does that all the time. I let it go in one ear and out the other. You got to have thick skin when you practice in front of Schroeder. And that in one ear and out the other comment is actually spot on and believable with Binger, because just like Judge Schroeder's rulings, they went in one ear and out the other, which was obvious by how Binger conducted himself throughout the trial. I'm sorry, he opened himself up to that one. I just had to. That's a big revelation to me. That Binger doesn't even think that Schroeder was more biased toward this defendant than any other defendant that's in his courtroom. Really shocking to me. And he disagreed that Schroeder got so mad about how he got into something that was ruled on pre-trial, and he was like, what am I supposed to do? Just stop in the middle of cross-examination and say, Judge, I need a recess to ask if I can go down this line of questioning. Well, to you non-lawyers out there, that might not seem practical, but the answer is absolutely yes. All the time in trial, we have to stop the case, say, Judge, we need a recess. I want to know if I can go down this line of questioning. And the reason we do that is so we don't get reamed out by the judge in the middle of trial or do something that's in bad faith or unethical. That's exactly why you do it. There are a million pauses throughout trial. One more is not going to make the difference. But it could make the difference with your reputation, especially with everyone watching. If you go down a line of questioning, clearly you should not have. Nobody would have thought any less from him if he would have asked for a recess and said, Judge, I want to go down this line of questioning. Can I? Judge said, I already ruled on that. No, move on. Nobody would have thought any less of Binger. But when you do it without asking, that's when it changes. So I disagree with him there. Absolutely, you can ask for a quick recess to get that answer. Then he says, well, when you're cross-examining a criminal defendant in a double homicide case, you should get a lot of leeway. No. The criminal defendant is the one with the constitutional rights we need to protect. So you don't just give willy-nilly leeway to everything in his case. Those rights are protected. Those are the utmost rights that are protected. And so no, you don't get a ton of leeway to just do whatever you want while he's on the stand. Now, you get a leeway with the subject matter because you've never deposed him and you can have some leeway with subject matter, but not leeway with going into things the judge has already said are not coming into this trial for very good reasons. So I disagreed with him there. He also said, and this is where it's kind of crazy. You guys might not realize the red tape that has to get cut through when lawyers that work at state attorney's offices or big companies have to get through before they can give these kind of answers. But he said,
our entire office is very familiar with him. He's a judge, like I said, who's got a lot of bark. Oftentimes his bark is worse than his bite, like is true for a lot of judges.
Right after giving those comments about Schroeder, how he's all bark and no bite, or his bark's a lot worse than his bite, and he's a little weird on the stand, zany or something like that. That is shocking to me that he's talking about a sitting judge, the longest tenured judge in the county where he practices. Shocking to me. It may not be so shocking to you, but it is shocking to me. He talked a little bit about why he decided to charge with the charges that he did. The lawyer doing the interview asked, why didn't you choose lesser? Binger basically explained to him that there were some lesser includeds that he did include, but they felt it fit a reckless homicide, so that's what they picked. Obviously, they picked the charge they felt the facts were in line with. Then Binger was like, and I have all these people ask me, why aren't you prosecuting the looters and the arsonists? He says, thanks, I am. I'm going to trial against one in January, and we are prosecuting these people. And then he drops the bombshell.
I mean, if Joseph Rosenbaum had not been killed that night, and I had all the video and photos that we wound up having, I would have charged him with arson, and I would have taken him to trial and hopefully convicted him, and maybe he would have gone to prison for committing arson. But he wouldn't have been killed. We don't kill people for arson.
So I want to know from you in the comments, do you believe Binger? Do you think he would have prosecuted Rosenbaum? If none of these shootings would have ever happened and these videos would have gone in the media and we all would have seen the looting and the arson that happened there and the destruction of property, do you think Binger would have prosecuted Rosenbaum? Because he says he would have. Next part of the interview centered around how Kyle Rittenhouse did on cross-examination. Binger had some thoughts.
You know, I've never in my life, and I've done over 100 jury trials, not all defendants testify, obviously, but I've never seen a defendant testify and then be cross-examined and there's no redirect.
We mentioned that on our video, and some other lawyers on YouTube have talked about it as well. And the consensus of most of the lawyers I've talked to is that they felt like Binger didn't do that much damage to Kyle Rittenhouse when he was on the stand, that Kyle Rittenhouse kind of got his point across. So when Kyle Rittenhouse was done with cross-examination, they just sat down because they thought it was good enough for them. They didn't need to redirect him, and that's why they didn't put on more evidence, because they felt like it was a win for them. Well, Binger thinks
they got him off the stand as quickly as they could, because they knew this is a kid who they can only fill his head with so much coaching, and then it's going to break down. And after 5 or 6 hours on the stand, it's not going to last. So they had a calculated strategy here. You know, they spent months, I'm sure, and money and time with whoever's out there helping to prep him for trial.
So he gives us some indication and some sour grapes about how this case went. He has given us indication that he thinks a ton of people were helping him in the background, that a ton of people were giving them money and spending a ton of money on this defense, and that they were coaching Kyle Rittenhouse and putting thoughts into his head, and it was calculated exactly how they wanted to get him on the stand and get him off the stand as quickly as they could, because they didn't trust him to present the way that they wanted him to present, and they were afraid he was going to come out and say something with his political agenda or something that was going to hurt his case. So they coached him, which is, in my opinion, a little inference to telling him what to say, whether it's true or not, because you don't necessarily have to coach somebody to tell the truth, right? I don't think a lot of people say it that way. So it infers that they coached him on what to say, whether it was true or not, and they were afraid he was going to slip up, so they wanted to get him off the stand as quickly as possible. That's the way Binger saw this testimony of Kyle Rittenhouse and the cross-examination and no redirect going.
He did what they asked him to do. He came across, he looked presentable, he told his side of the story. He had his day in court. There was a time in which he started breaking down and crying, which I thought was unconvincing. I thought that it was prompted by his own selfish fear, or what he claimed to be his fear at that time, which I think is a less than sympathetic prompt for crying.
And he thought they were manufactured crocodile tears, which had no effect on the jury, and the jury saw right through them. There was a lot of talk about these tears from Kyle Rittenhouse. Some people thought they were genuine, some people did not. Well, Binger thought they were absolutely manufactured crocodile tears. I believe that's a quote, but he found them unconvincing, and he thought the jury saw right through it. Well, not sure the jury saw right through it, since they ruled in Kyle Rittenhouse's favor across the board. Not saying they bought it, but I'm not sure they saw it as fake crocodile manufactured tears that they saw right through. I disagree with that, Mr. Binger. Then he was asked about his cross-examination.
On cross, I did my best. I don't take a ton amount of pride in it. I think I could have done better.
I probably agree with him there. He lets us in again on another worry he had with the case, and that was that initial fired shot by Zeminski, and how, that was something the defense could lean into, but Kyle Rittenhouse on cross kind of said it didn't have a big effect on him, and then he told us, I am prosecuting Zeminski. I think that might be the trial that's going in January for arson. That's obviously why he wasn't called to the stand, I would guess, but he said, he was kind of a ancillary issue in the case, is kind of how he tried to brush that off. And he also mentioned how even though that shot was fired, and how some states like Florida, my state, have the stand your ground law. That's not what we have in Minnesota, and he took too much force based on the entire circumstances, which we already know ad nauseum how he feels about that based on his arguments. So the next kind of portion I thought was interesting is he said he didn't know how much he wanted to get into the videos and pictures throughout the trial and while Rittenhouse was on the stand, which I find interesting because we watched the trial. If you go back to him objecting to the defense using all that in opening statements, and one of his arguments was, Judge, he shouldn't be able to use that in opening statement. I didn't use it in mine. And the judge rightfully said, that's not the standard. What you did is not the standard. You're not objecting to it. It's all coming into evidence. He can use it in opening. Well, it turns out we find out the real reason Binger didn't want to use it is because, or he didn't want the defense to be allowed to use it, is because he wasn't sure how much he was going to use it, because he wasn't sure how good it was for him, meaning he probably thought it was bad for him. And the defense using it means they probably agreed, which means it was probably good for the defense, and that's why Binger was objecting. Which we all knew. We knew as much as we could have without getting into somebody's mind, but now it's confirmed. That's why Binger didn't want them to use it in opening. Then the interviewer asked, why did you use that active shooter term? Do you think that was a little too high of a bar for what you proved? And Binger admitted.
And Dave, I think I probably didn't communicate that notion very well, because you've characterized what I said in a way that others have too, and it's clearly that I didn't make this distinction very, very well at the trial, because I wasn't actually trying to say myself that he was an active shooter, but what I was trying to say is that from the crowd's perspective, that's how they viewed him. And that was a reasonable assumption on their part at that particular moment.
But that is very confusing, because you did in fact call him an active shooter and then didn't prove that he was in fact an active shooter. And sometimes juries actually hold prosecutors to what they say. So it was a point by the interviewer actually made against Binger. Then the interviewer asked, what do you think the turning point was? Was it Gage Grosskreuz's testimony? Because it seemed like that was kind of good for the defense. That's basically what the interviewer said. And here are some more bombshells dropped by Binger. Binger was very concerned about Gage Grosskreuz's testimony. He considered not calling him at all and told Gage Grosskreuz's lawyers that he might not call him because he thinks his testimony does more harm than good. So one of the living victims in the case, he was one of the main victims, you weren't going to call him and put him in front of the jury. Why? At the end of this interview, they talk about how he's a finder of truth. That's what prosecutors are. They just tell what the facts are. They represent the people. But you didn't want to let the people hear from the victim. And if you say you're being unfair, Peter, that's not what Binger said at all. He just said he considered not calling him. He wasn't saying he was trying to hide anything from the victim. Well, you'd be wrong. Because if you continue listening in the interview, Binger himself says, but I decided I didn't want to hold anything back from the jury. I didn't want to hide anything from the jury. I wanted to show all my cards, so I decided to call him. So he did consider hiding something from the jury. That's literally what he's saying here. And he also admits that he knew it wasn't going to go well for them, or at least he had a sneaking suspicion that Grosskreuz's testimony is not going to go well. And that's what we talked about in our videos, that was the turning point. I think that was the best witness for the defense. Then he made some very weird comment, and it was almost like Binger didn't sit through this trial, because he made some comment about how the defense kept arguing that if you had a gun, you deserved to die. I don't remember that coming out in the trial. And sometimes, to be fair, and this is really hard sometimes, when you prep a case and the judge keeps something out, and then when you've been prepping for this case for months or even years, and then you have a week, 2 week, 3 week, however long the trial is, you've got to remember what actually came out in trial versus what you argued about for the whole entirety of the case. So he may have been confusing this with some other hearing or some time he was talking to the defense attorneys, not necessarily trial, because I don't remember that coming out in trial. And that is a totally illogical argument, since in fact, Kyle Rittenhouse had a gun, which he said, I basically chuckled when they said everybody deserved to die. I was like, your guy had a gun, so did he deserve to die? Then it was only people who were pointing their guns at people. Well, your guy pointed the gun at people. 5 or 10 people testified in this trial that had guns that night. They didn't argue all those people should have died. Balch and all the people that were at the car source with guns, they didn't argue they should have died. Just when you point your gun at somebody as you charge up to them, they argued that it was deadly force that was necessary to shoot Gage. That's what they argued. So a very strange comment and argument for Binger that makes me think, like, was he confused? Like, what's he talking about? Another thing with this interviewer kind of showing his cards, and I want to be respectful. I don't know this guy at all. I don't mean to be mean. He definitely seemed like he was on Binger's side. which I would assume Binger's only going to go on and do an interview of somebody that he feels comfortable with. But then he asks the big question that none of you guys have asked on my channel. That's not true. A couple of you have, but you're not practicing lawyers like this guy. And the question is,
you've decided here not to appeal. There's not going to be an appeal of this, or is
it's not possible. On a not guilty verdict, the state has no right to an appeal.
What? You can't appeal. It's a not guilty verdict. Then they mentioned some statements made by Kyle Rittenhouse, how he wants to become a lawyer to fight against prosecutors like Binger. And they had a little chuckle about that when then Binger says, oh, I haven't paid any attention to Kyle Rittenhouse since that trial was done. I still get hate emails, but I'm not paying any attention. I'm trying a sexual battery case now. I've got other cases happening in the future. I'm not thinking about Kyle Rittenhouse, as he's doing an hour-long interview focused completely on the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. I just thought that was funny. But I mean, who can blame him? Like, obviously this is a big case. It's going to be something that follows him for a while. I don't think there's any hate in him talking about the Kyle Rittenhouse case. I can understand why he would want to forget it, but that was interesting. So here is probably the last bombshell to me, and the last answer, the big answer that we've been waiting on. Did Binger have a choice? Did somebody go above him and say, you have to charge this, you have to try this, I know you don't want to, but you've got to? The answer is no. Binger said, I have discretion and freedom in my office to choose the cases I want to try, to choose what I want to charge. And I'm very thankful for that. And he goes on to compare private practice to being a prosecutor. I just figured he was a lifelong prosecutor because he's got so much experience as a prosecutor. But he said half his career was in private practice and now half he's been a prosecutor. So it seems like he did it a little backwards. Instead of starting as a prosecutor, as a lot of people do, and then going to private practice, it seems like he did private practice, then went back to being a prosecutor because he said private practice wasn't for him. I have some thoughts there, but we're not going to get into them today. But he basically says, I'm a big shot there. At private practice, he said I wasn't able to choose my own cases. So he must have worked at a big firm where he was kind of low on the totem pole, because a lot of private practice attorneys, if you run your own firm, that's exactly what you do. You can turn away clients and cases if you don't want them. But as a prosecutor, you can't really. But he's basically saying he's got more discretion as a prosecutor. So he had discretion to do this. He feels like he made the right decision. He would do it again. He stands firm in his belief that the jury just didn't know what kind of guy Kyle Rittenhouse was. If they did, they would have convicted him. And he knew what kind of guy he was, so he made the right decision in charging him. He had the discretion. He made the decision. He confirms that for us and answers that question that we couldn't have known but for Binger telling us. Then he takes it a step further to say, I don't know why everybody's focusing on me. I'm nothing special. I'm just doing what 10,000 plus other prosecutors do across the country. And I did, in this case, exactly what 9,999 other prosecutors would have done. And that's where he's wrong. I know for a fact that plenty of other prosecutors would have handled this case differently. They either wouldn't have charged him at all, would have charged him with something lesser and tried to get some kind of plea deal, or would have never, ever taken this case to trial, even if they would have charged it, taken it the whole way. Once the facts came out, once the pretrial motions were made and the decisions from the judge came down, once those other counts were dismissed, plenty of prosecutors would have made the right decision to dismiss these charges and dealt with the political blowback from the media. So I'm not going to say at all that the other 9,000 plus prosecutors in our country would have done what Binger said. I totally disagree with him. Sure, some would have. But when he says I'm just doing my job and my job is to prosecute these cases, charge these cases, try these cases, he's wrong. They talked about it. He's an administrator of justice. He fights for the truth. And in this case, he did something that I think a lot of prosecutors would not have done once they knew all the facts that would come out at trial. I understand disagreeing with Kyle Rittenhouse's actions. We've talked about how I think it was unwise. But once we saw the facts, the only verdict that was just was a not guilty verdict. And I think that was the right verdict in this case. And we talked about that on this channel as we went. But some serious bombshells came out, in my opinion. We learned a ton. Let me know what you learned listening to this interview. If anything stuck out to you that I missed or didn't talk about, put it in the comments and let me know. We can discuss it further. But I thought this was really interesting and worth doing a video on. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. I can never tell exactly what it is you want to hear from me, but I hope this was one in that niche, because this was really interesting to me. And I had a lot of thoughts as a former prosecutor and criminal defense attorney on how we talk about these cases and reflect on trials. And I thought he made some really interesting comments and candid comments in this case. So Thanks for listening, and as always, subscribe to our channel and like this video if you haven't already, because it does help us. The more likes, the better. But for now, that's all we've got. Thanks for watching this episode of The Lawyer You Know. If you like this content, please share it with your friends. Make sure you subscribe to our page and like our videos. If you want some interaction, get in the comments and we'll be sure to get back to you. If you want to know any more information about our firm or this page, you can find out in the description or visit tragoslaw.com. We post multiple times throughout the week, so make sure you hit that bell so you can get the notification and not miss out on the next episode.